No contact alone will not crush a narcissist's ego. In fact, sometimes it feeds it. If you really want to dismantle their ego, you don't disappear. You transform in a way they can no longer access. If you're committed to not just surviving narcissistic abuse, but evolving past it, comment irrelevant below. That word matters. No contact is a boundary, not a transformation. And this distinction is where so many people misunderstand the process. When you first implement no contact, you are doing something critically important. You are creating distance from manipulation, gaslighting, emotional volatility, and psychological harm. You are stopping the active exposure to dysfunction. But stopping exposure is not the same as healing the injury. It is containment, not reconstruction. Think of it like leaving a burning building. Walking out saves your life, but it does not immediately heal the smoke in your lungs or calm your nervous system. In the same way, blocking a narcissist's number, avoiding their social media, and refusing to engage protects you from further damage. However, the trauma bond, the hypervigilance, the rumination, and the emotional triggers can still be very much alive inside you. This is where people get confused. They assume that because communication has stopped, growth has automatically begun. But transformation requires intentional internal work. It requires examining why the dynamic hooked you, why intermittent reinforcement felt addictive, why validation from someone emotionally unavailable felt so powerful. Without that deeper work, no contact can become a silent waiting room rather than a launching point for change. A narcissist's ego may feel challenged by your absence, but if your identity is still organized around the relationship, even in anger, then psychologically they still occupy space. You might not be texting them, but you are replaying conversations, imagining confrontations, checking their online status through alternate accounts. That is not freedom, that is invisible engagement. True transformation begins when you shift the focus from what they are doing to what you are building. Emotional regulation, self-trust, stronger boundaries, therapy, supportive friendships, financial independence, these are identity level upgrades. No contact creates the silence necessary for growth, but it does not automatically produce it. The boundary stops the chaos. The transformation begins when you use that quiet to rebuild yourself from the inside out. Narcissistic ego feeds on emotional reactivity. And here is the part most people miss. It does not care whether that emotion is positive or negative. Love, admiration, fear, anger, tears, long explanations, even outrage. All of it signals the same thing to a narcissistic structure. I still matter. I still have impact. I still control the emotional climate. That impact is the supply. When you react intensely, your nervous system becomes activated. Your voice changes. Your body language shifts. You send paragraphs trying to defend yourself. You argue your reality. You cry. You plead. You rage. To a healthy person, that may signal pain or a need for resolution. But to a narcissistic ego, it confirms power. It proves they can reach inside you and flip a switch. Even negative reactions are rewarding. If you send an angry message, they know they provoked you. If you defend yourself for an hour, they know you still care what they think. If you try to prove your worth, they know their opinion still defines your emotional state. Reactivity reassures them that they are central in your psychological world. This is why many narcissists escalate when they sense detachment. They may insult, triangulate, bait, or fabricate crises. They are not seeking resolution. They are seeking activation. Emotional intensity, especially when they caused it, restores their sense of dominance. The most destabilizing shift is not shouting louder or crafting the perfect comeback. It is emotional flatness. When provocation is met with calm neutrality, something profound happens. There is no spike, no visible wound, no dramatic defense. The mirror they rely on to reflect their importance goes blank. That blankness feels threatening because narcissistic identity is externally regulated. It depends on feedback loops. When those loops disappear, insecurity surfaces. They may attempt stronger tactics to regain a reaction because silence without emotion feels different from silence filled with resentment. Understanding this changes how you approach interactions. The goal is not to win the argument, it is to exit the emotional arena. When your nervous system remains steady, when your responses are minimal and uncharged, you quietly remove the reinforcement that once sustained the dynamic. That absence of reactivity is where real power begins to shift. True ego injury happens when you become indifferent, not angry. Anger still contains attachment. Anger still says, you matter enough to affect me. And as long as someone can affect you, they still occupy psychological territory in your life. Indifference is different. Indifference is emotional neutrality. It is not suppression. It is not pretending. It is the natural outcome of detachment when the nervous system is no longer hooked. And to a narcissistic ego, indifference is deeply destabilizing because it removes their sense of significance. When you are angry, you might block them, but you are still thinking about them. You might post indirectly about them. You might rehearse speeches in your head about what you would say if they called. That energy, even in silence, is charged, and narcissistic personalities are highly attuned to emotional charge. They can sense when they still have relevance. But indifference feels cold in a different way. It is not reactive. It does not seek closure. It does not fantasize about revenge or reconciliation. It does not need them to understand. When you reach indifference, their opinion genuinely stops shaping your mood. Their name does not spike your heart rate. Their success does not threaten you. Their failure does not satisfy you. For someone whose ego is structured around being central, unforgettable, and impactful, this is profoundly uncomfortable. Narcissistic identity relies on being special, either admired or feared. Indifference strips both. If you are not admiring and you are not fighting, they cannot locate themselves in your emotional landscape. This is why some narcissists attempt hoovering long after a relationship ends. They are not always seeking love. They are seeking confirmation that they still matter. A response, even an irritated one, reassures them. But when there is calm non-engagement, not forced, not performative, but authentic, it signals that the psychological supply line is gone. Indifference develops gradually. It comes from grieving, processing, rebuilding self-worth, and redirecting attention toward your own life. It is not a tactic, it is a state. And once you reach it, the dynamic fundamentally shifts because their ego no longer has a mirror to feed on. Emotional regulation is more powerful than confrontation, especially in dynamics involving narcissistic behavior. Confrontation feels strong in the moment. It feels assertive. You gather your evidence, you outline the lies, you point out the contradictions, and you expect that clarity will create accountability. But with a narcissistic personality structure, confrontation often turns into fuel. They do not experience it as a constructive exchange. They experience it as engagement. When you confront from a dysregulated state, elevated heart rate, shaking voice, urgency to be understood, your nervous system is activated. In that activation, you are more likely to over-explain, defend, justify, or escalate. That intensity communicates investment. It shows that their behavior has penetrated you emotionally. And for someone who equates emotional impact with power, that reaction reinforces their position. Emotional regulation changes the entire equation. Regulation means your body is steady, your tone is calm, your responses are brief and intentional. You are not trying to win, you are not trying to convince, you are not trying to force insight. You are simply stating a boundary or choosing not to engage at all. That steadiness removes the drama that narcissistic dynamics depend on. When there is no dramatic spike, there is nothing to push against. If they bait you and you respond with neutrality, the anticipated escalation collapses. If they attempt to provoke jealousy and you remain composed, the strategy loses momentum. Regulation deprives the interaction of emotional volatility, and volatility is often the currency of control. This does not mean you suppress your feelings. It means you process them in safe spaces, therapy, trusted friends, journaling, rather than in direct combat with someone who thrives on distortion. Regulation is an internal skill. It is the ability to notice your trigger, pause, and choose a response rather than react impulsively. Over time, this steadiness shifts power. You are no longer pulled into circular arguments. You are no longer defending your reality. You conserve energy, and in that conservation, you reclaim autonomy. The absence of emotional chaos becomes the boundary itself, and the dynamic weakens because it no longer receives the intensity it once relied on. Rebuilding your identity dismantles the narcissist's control narrative in ways that arguments never could. In narcissistic dynamics, control is not always loud or obvious. It is often subtle, psychological, and gradual. Over time, your preferences shift to avoid conflict. Your goals shrink to maintain harmony. Your confidence erodes under criticism disguised as honesty. Slowly, your identity begins organizing itself around their moods, their needs, their validation. A narcissistic control narrative depends on you internalizing certain beliefs that you are difficult, overly sensitive, lucky they tolerate you, incapable without them, or somehow incomplete. These messages may not always be spoken directly. They are reinforced through gaslighting, comparison, withholding affection, or moving goalposts, so you are constantly striving to prove your worth. When you begin rebuilding your identity, you challenge that narrative at its foundation. This is not about cosmetic change or performative success. It is about reconnecting with who you were before the distortion, your interests, values, talents, and independent decision-making. It might look like returning to hobbies you abandoned, pursuing education, strengthening friendships that were isolated, or developing financial autonomy. Each step reinforces a new internal story. I am capable. I am whole. I can function and thrive without external control. As your self-definition strengthens, the old narrative loses credibility. The criticisms that once felt devastating begin to feel inaccurate. The approval you once chased becomes less relevant. The dependency that maintained the dynamic weakens because your sense of self is no longer anchored to their perception. This is profoundly destabilizing to a narcissistic structure because their influence relied on shaping how you saw yourself. If you no longer view yourself through their lens, their leverage diminishes. They may attempt to reassert control through guilt, charm, or intimidation, but those tactics depend on you doubting your own autonomy. Identity reconstruction is not instant. It requires reflection, support, and sometimes grief for the version of yourself that was minimized. But as your internal stability grows, the psychological grip loosens. The control narrative collapses not through confrontation, but because it no longer matches the reality you are actively building and embodying. Silence without healing still leaves psychological hooks in place. You can block a number, delete photos, avoid shared spaces, and refuse communication, and yet still feel emotionally tethered. That tether is the hook. It lives in unresolved trauma, unanswered questions, cognitive dissonance, and the lingering hope that one day it will all make sense. When a narcissistic dynamic ends, it rarely ends with clarity. There is often no genuine accountability, no coherent closure, no satisfying explanation. The brain struggles with that ambiguity. It replays events, searching for logic. It tries to reconcile the loving moments with the cruelty. That mental looping keeps the attachment alive even in physical absence. This is where silence can be misleading. On the outside, you appear detached. On the inside, your nervous system may still be on alert. You might still anticipate a message. You might check their social media through indirect means. You might imagine running into them and mentally rehearse what you would say. Those are hooks. They signal unfinished processing. Trauma bonds intensify this. Intermittent reinforcement, cycles of affection and withdrawal, conditions the brain to crave resolution. The unpredictability creates addiction-like patterns. So when contact stops, the body can experience withdrawal, anxiety, longing, intrusive thoughts. Without intentional healing work, silence alone does not dissolve that conditioning. Healing involves examining the distortions you internalized, grieving the fantasy of who you hoped they would become, and regulating the nervous system responses that were shaped by chronic stress. Therapy, education about narcissistic patterns, somatic practices, and supportive relationships all help untangle those hooks. If the hooks remain, there is vulnerability. A single hoovering message can reactivate hope. A vague apology can reopen wounds. Silence protected you, but without healing, it did not fortify you. The goal is not just distance from the person, it is freedom from the psychological grip. When the hooks are removed, their name does not trigger adrenaline. Their attempts to re-enter feel transparent rather than tempting. Silence then becomes solid, not fragile. It is no longer a strategy you are struggling to maintain. It is a reflection of genuine detachment rooted in understanding and recovery. Strategic non-engagement includes social, digital, and psychological distance, and this is where many people underestimate the depth required to truly disengage. They assume that if they stop replying to messages, the work is done. But narcissistic dynamics often operate across multiple channels of access, and leaving even one open can keep the cycle alive. Social distance means evaluating shared environments. Mutual friends, workplaces, family gatherings, these can become indirect pipelines of information. Narcissistic individuals may use triangulation, sending messages through others, portraying themselves as the victim, or subtly fishing for updates about you. Strategic non-engagement sometimes requires tightening your circle, setting clear boundaries with mutual contacts, and refusing to participate in conversations about them. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. Digital distance is equally critical. Social media is one of the most powerful tools for maintaining psychological hooks. Checking their stories, analyzing who liked their posts, decoding captions. This keeps your nervous system activated. Even if you never interact, you are consuming stimuli that trigger comparison, anger, or longing. Blocking is not immature, it is protective. Removing digital visibility reduces temptation and minimizes opportunities for hoovering, breadcrumbing, or image management tactics meant to provoke you. Psychological distance is the most subtle and the most powerful. It involves withdrawing from internal dialogues about them. It means noticing when you are constructing imaginary arguments or fantasizing about future confrontations. It requires interrupting rumination and redirecting attention toward your own growth. Psychological distance also includes refusing to carry their narrative about you. If they labeled you too sensitive or unstable, non-engagement means not arguing with that label internally anymore. Strategic non-engagement is intentional. It anticipates attempts to regain access and quietly closes those doors in advance. It is not reactive, it is planned. The goal is not to punish. It is to remove all pathways that once allowed manipulation to travel. When social, digital, and psychological channels are sealed, the dynamic loses oxygen. There is no audience, no update stream, no emotional echo. What remains is your space, clearer, calmer, and no longer shaped by someone else's need for control. The ultimate crush is your visible detachment and growth, not revenge, not public exposure, not proving you were right. What destabilizes a narcissistic ego most is watching someone they once controlled become emotionally self-sufficient and forward-moving without them. Narcissistic dynamics rely on a hierarchy. They position themselves as superior, more desirable, more powerful, more needed. Whether through charm or intimidation, the unspoken assumption is that you will orbit them. Your happiness will depend on their approval. Your confidence will fluctuate based on their validation. When you detach and then actively grow, you disrupt that hierarchy. Visible detachment does not mean performative indifference. It means your energy is no longer organized around them. You are not posting to provoke them. You are not succeeding to make them jealous. You are building a life because it aligns with your values. The visibility is a byproduct of authentic progress, not a strategy to trigger envy. Growth amplifies this shift. When you pursue new skills, improve your health, deepen friendships, or expand professionally, you are reinforcing a powerful message. Your life did not shrink after their exit, it expanded. That expansion contradicts the narrative that you were dependent, incapable, or lucky to have them. It demonstrates resilience. For someone whose ego depends on being unforgettable and irreplaceable, this is deeply unsettling. If you are thriving, it implies they were not the source of your worth. If you are calm, it implies they no longer have emotional leverage. If you are content, it implies their absence is not catastrophic.